In November last year, 150 Tamils made a daring bid for freedom. They left the southern port of Matara in small fishing boats like this, bound for Australia. But their journey ended in chains. A Sri Lankan naval patrol spotted the men in Sri Lankan waters. They were taken back to Matara and thrown in jail. Now they're being taken to court to face charges of illegal migration. But many, like Krisant Padmanathan, are already planning their next escape.
Ana Sri Lanka vittu Sri Lanka vittu போறதுக்கு எப்படி வசதி இருக்குதோ அது எந்த வசதியோ அது என்ன உயிர் போகக்கூடிய வசதி என்றால் அது பிரச்சனை நான் தயங்க மாட்டேன்.
This is the catch-22 for young ethnic Tamils. They face suspicion of involvement in the civil war, so it's dangerous to stay in Sri Lanka, but it's dangerous to leave. Hundreds of relatives have come to the court, including Padmanathan's mother, Nessamella.
There is no money, no lunch, no food, no rest, everything, nothing. Just go Australia, take money.
They tell stories of daily harassment from a government and military dominated by ethnic Sinhalese.
Not safety, Sri Lanka. Not safety, Sri Lanka.
Inside the court, the proceedings are held in Sinhala, Sri Lanka's official language. The Tamil prisoners barely understand a word of it, and there's no translation. It's only when they're led back to the bus that they realise the judge has granted bail. Their relatives must now scramble to find $3,000 to release each man, a sum many simply can't afford. There's a lot of talk about whether they're fleeing persecution or are simply economic migrants. But the reality is that for these people, it's one and the same. The war has destroyed their livelihood, their sense of safety, any hope they had of a decent life for their families. And no matter what laws are passed in Australia or what politicians say in Canberra, Australia will remain the beacon.
These Tamil people cannot stay here. Then he go to pay money, then he go to Australia, want to save the human.
But Australia says if people come by boat, they will be sent back to Sri Lanka.
Because there is no any government help to go by the flight. That's why they went by the boats.
By nightfall, Nessamella has found someone to guarantee the bail bond to get her son released. She hugs him for the first time in 2 months. Do you still want to go to Australia?
Yeah, I like it. That's it. Again, maybe.
On a boat?
Yeah, I can't tell anything. That's it.
But not everyone was celebrating. More than 30 were denied bail on suspicion of being Tamil fighters. Tamils have been fighting for a separate homeland since 1983. The Tamil Tigers, or LTTE, was both a liberation army and a terrorist group, using child soldiers and suicide bombers. Many Tamils supported their goals, even if they deplored their methods. Last year, the Sri Lankan army wiped them out in a bloodbath that shocked the world.
A population of some 300,000 people, plus the Tamil Tiger forces, were caught in an area about the size of Central Park in New York City. They were within range of all the armaments that were being used to smash the Tamil Tiger lines.
Gordon Weiss was the UN spokesman in Sri Lanka for the past 3 years. He resigned in December to return to Australia and can now speak openly for the first time.
A lot of civilians died inside the siege zone. I have heard anything between 10 and 40,000 people, and that's from reliable sources who had a presence inside the zone.
So up to 40,000 civilians could have been killed in those last battles.
That's right.
That's a shocking figure.
Yeah, it's a terrible figure.
What's more, he says the Sri Lankan government knowingly misled the international community about what was really going on.
They repeated a number of things that were either intentionally misleading or were lies. One senior government civil servant remarked at the end of the war that the government insistence that the figures were very low was a ploy. It was a ploy to allow the government to get on with its business.
That business was finishing off once and for all one of the world's most ruthless guerrilla movements. The Tigers had little compassion for civilians, using them as human shields.
We have pretty good testimony that the Tamil Tigers were killing people consistently to stop them from getting out.
Foreign correspondent has obtained photos taken in the last days of fighting that show how unarmed men, women and children bore the brunt of the attacks.
If one looks at the numbers of civilians who died during this time, I think it speaks for itself that not enough care was shown in order to preserve the lives of the innocent.
Do you think senior government officials, even President Rajapaksa himself, should be investigated for war crimes?
Well, I think, as is the case with war crimes, it's a question of the chain of command and where the buck finally stopped.
But to most Sinhalese, the army's victory was a triumph over almost 3 decades of terrorism. And the man who ordered the campaign has become a national hero. President Mahinda Rajapaksa was comfortably re-elected 2 weeks ago after taking full credit for defeating the Tiger Army of the LTTE. He denies that civilians were targeted or that Tamils are now fleeing from reprisals. So we're from Australian television.
Yeah.
There is much concern about Tamils coming to Australia in boats. Will that problem be solved?
Yes, now I think it is solved. Most of the problems. Because it was organized by the LTT. Because that was the way of, they were drug dealers and trafficking, drug arms and smuggling, human smuggling.
But the asylum seekers tell a different story. We caught up with the mother and son we'd met at prison back at their rented home in Batticaloa in the northeast. They had to sell their house and land to raise $20,000 for the people smugglers. He's got no beard. No beard, where to go? Padmanathan told me he had taken the boat to avoid being killed.
Now உயிருக்கு பயத்தில் எங்கனாலும் போய் சந்தோஷமாக இப்போ மட்டும் ஃபேமிலிக்கு ஒருத்தருக்கும் வேலை செய்கிறதுக்கு ஒருத்தரும் இல்லை அங்கனாலும் போய் சந்தோஷமாக இருந்து நம்ம ஃபேமிலியை.
In 1992, as the civil war raged around them, his father was abducted and murdered. 4 years ago, his uncle disappeared. Last year, while running a small photocopying business, he says anonymous phone callers told him he would be next.
அந்த கடையில் இருக்கவங்களாம் அப்படி சில மிரட்டல்கள் வந்து ஒரு நல்ல ஏற்கனவே அப்பாவும் இல்லாமல் போயிட்டார், நீ அப்படி ஒரு இது சித்தப்பாவும் இல்லாமல் போயிட்டார், நீ அப்படி ஒரு இது நடக்கப்படான்றதுக்காக தான்.
The shop provides barely enough income for the family to eat. As the only breadwinner, he felt a responsibility to try to find work in Australia. Despite the family's history of persecution, he saw no point in applying for a visa from the Australian High Commission.
அண்ணா செஞ்சு அது ரிஜெக்ட் ஆகப்பட்டது. கொழம்புக்கு இன்டர்வியூக்கெல்லாம் போய் நிறைய காசு போனது. அந்த இதில் அந்த சந்தேகத்தால் நாங்கள் ட்ரை பண்ணலை. அண்ணா ட்ரை பண்ணி ஒரு கிடைக்கல. அண்ணா சுவிஸ் எம்பசிக்கு ட்ரை பண்ணவர், அது கிடைக்கல. அதுக்கப்புறம் அந்த ஃபீலிங்கில் நாங்கள் அதை விட்டுட்டோம்.
There has been a lot of changes to the immigration law in Australia and a lot of debate in our parliament about migration. Were you aware of any of this?
பெரிசாரியெல்லாம் ஓரளவு வாழ்ந்த சில விஷயங்கள் தெரிஞ்சு சில பேர் கதைக்கிறதை கொண்டு அறிஞ்சிருக்கோம்.
Did that influence your decision to go to Australia?
அப்படி ஈஸியாக போகலாண்டா எங்களுக்குள்ள பிரச்சனைக்குரிய அந்த இது பிரச்சனை தீரணுமாண்டா அந்த பிரச்சனைக்குரிய முழு அந்தஸ்து இருந்தாருன்னா ஆஸ்திரேலியா என்ற இதெல்லாம் ஆஸ்திரேலியாவுக்கு போனால் தான் எங்களுக்குரிய அந்தஸ்து கிடைக்கும், எங்களுக்குரிய அந்த பிரச்சனைக்குரிய தீர்வு கிடைக்கும்ன்ற இதெல்லாம் நாங்கள் போனாங்க. நாங்கள் முழுமையாக நம்புகிறோம்.
They waited 10 days at sea for a promised ship to pick them up. It never came. Instead, the Navy found them.
வளைச்சி பிடிக்கக்குள்ள அப்பையும் 2 பேர் இந்த முடி இது பாய எடுத்தாக்கல பிடிச்சி நேவி அடித்து அவங்க நேவியில் போட்டில் ஏற்றி கொண்டு பிரச்சனையில் நேவியில் கேம்பில் வச்சு ஒரு நாள் விசாரித்து அதுக்கப்புறம் பூசாவில் கொண்டு போட்டு விசாரித்தாங்க.
Even in prison, they were second-class citizens. He claims they were crammed into the worst cells and were beaten and bullied by Sinhalese prisoners.
திருப்பி சாப்பாடு வேண்ட போனாலும் எங்கன்னா ஆஸ்திரேலியன் ஆகலாம் ஏண்டா இப்போ ஆஸ்திரேலியன் ஆக்கள் பின்னுக்கு நில்லுங்க, மற்ற ஆக்கள் முன்னுக்கு நில்லுங்கன்னு கடைசியில் அவங்களுக்கு சாப்பாடு. கடைசியில் சாப்பாடுக்குள்ளே அவங்க எல்லா சாப்பாடும் முடிஞ்சிருந்துச்சு சார். இப்போ 100 பேருக்குரிய சாப்பாடுன்னா அங்கே இருக்கிறது 20 பேருக்குரிய சாப்பாடாக இருந்துச்சு.
Since his release on bail, he's been getting back to his one passion, cricket. This is the one time he and his friends can forget their troubles. But even here, they're nervous about the continuing presence of police and soldiers.
24 வயசாக இதுவரையில் எங்களுக்கு உரிமைன்றதில் நாங்கள் நடந்ததில்லை. ஏண்டா இன்றைக்கு விளையாட போனாலும் கிரிக்கெட் கிரவுண்ட்ஸுக்கு போனாலும் 5-5:30க்கு பிறகு வெளியில் நிற்கலாது. இப்பையும் கொஞ்சம் இப்பையும் பயமாக கிடக்கு.
Cricket was once one of the few institutions that bound the country together. Now these Tamils no longer see Sri Lanka as their country. So who would you rather play for, Australia or Sri Lanka?
Australia and South Africa.
You don't support Sri Lanka?
I can't support Australia.
Tamils like the Patmanatans aren't just separated from their Sinhalese neighbours by race and language, but also religion. Their ancestors migrated from southern India, and they've retained their Hindu beliefs. The Sinhalese, who make up 3/4 of the population, are overwhelmingly Buddhist. In many societies, this wouldn't be a problem. But in Sri Lanka, Buddhist faith goes hand in hand with Sinhalese identity and nationalism.
There's a long history of political Buddhism in Sri Lanka. The extreme Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka holds that Sri Lanka has always been dominated by the Sinhalese and by the Buddhists, for as long as recorded history. They exclude totally the claims of the Tamils or the Muslims or any other segment of society to any sort of role in government which would threaten, as they see it, the Sinhalese hegemony there.
At any public event, President Rajapaksa is shadowed by senior monks. Many urged him publicly to crush the Hindu tigers.
The Rajapaksa administration is seen as being closely tied to Sinhalese nationalism and to Buddhism, and I don't think that the administration feels inclined to deliver any serious reconciliation for the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, but we'll have to wait and see.
So far, the president's rule has seen increased authoritarianism. Not just against Tamils, but against his Sinhalese critics too. An armed guard is now an essential companion for any independent newspaper. Frederica Jans is editor of the Sunday Leader, one of the few newspapers still critical of the president. It's a dangerous business.
Horrible, those scenes at the hospital when we were there.
She was promoted last year after her predecessor, Lasantha Wickrematunge, was murdered.
I hold the current government, the Rajapaksa government, completely responsible. Whether they initiate the attacks, I don't know. We have no proof. Whether they killed Lasantha, I don't know. Again, we have no proof. However, the fact that Lasantha's investigation has gone nowhere is proof, I believe, that his killers are close or are known to the highest authority in this land.
Wickrematunge was only one of dozens of journalists to be killed, beaten or abducted since Rajapaksa came to power. Not a single case has been solved.
We have continued to be threatened and harassed. We have continued to receive death threats, both myself and my news editor and editor of the investigations desk, all women. The reality is that there is very little press freedom practiced in this country. Most of the press has been cowered or into submission. They're too afraid to be free anymore or to write without any kind of self-censorship.
The president's unbridled power was on display just a few days ago at Sri Lanka's annual celebration of independence. But in recent months, more evidence has emerged of army atrocities in last year's offensive. This mobile phone footage, smuggled out of the country, shows Sinhalese soldiers executing prisoners. The government simply dismissed it as a fabrication, even after a UN investigation authenticated the video.
The government reacted in its typical fashion with hysterical denunciations. This is what happens in war. It's not a surprise, but it was in line with the very consistent government denials that anything was ever wrong inside the war zone.
Thanks to the support of countries like China, Rajapaksa has escaped censure from the United Nations. The Security Council ignored reports from its own officials of massive civilian casualties. The UN Human Rights Council even praised Sri Lanka's actions.
Personally, I think that was a disgrace, especially when it's stacked up alongside the 12 or 13 resolutions condemning the Israeli invasion of Gaza that was going on at the same time.
One man who could tell all is the former army chief, General Sarat Fonseca, who commanded the offensive. He stood against the president in last month's election after he was demoted to a ceremonial position. Yesterday, the general offered to give evidence to any war crimes inquiry. Within hours, he was arrested and charged with unspecified military offences. Civilians who survived the offensive have continued to suffer. Up to 290,000 people were interned in camps so the government could search for Tamil fighters.
The first month that people were in those camps, the conditions were truly terrible. The first 6 weeks when it was really critical to reach people to ensure that unnecessary numbers of people weren't dying as a result of lack of care. There was not sufficient access to those camps.
Journalists have not been allowed to investigate conditions, but on election day we were allowed a brief visit to one of the most developed camps. 8 months on, tarpaulins and disease-ridden tents have been replaced by semi-permanent dwellings. Under international pressure, the government had agreed to empty the camps by now, but tens of thousands of people remain, simply because they have nowhere else to go. Either the military has sealed off their villages, or their homes have been destroyed. For many Tamils, the events of the past year have destroyed any reason for staying in Sri Lanka. Padmanathan goes back to court later this month to face fines or further jail. But when it's over, he plans to leave. Police have already branded him a traitor.
ஆனால் இப்போ இல்லைன்னு சொன்னால் நாங்கள் உங்களை எல்லாத்தையும் வச்சு நாங்கள் பிடிப்போம் என்று சொன்னோம். நான் நான் எல்டியில் ஒரு நாள் கூட இல்லை. அதுக்கு பிறகு சார் அதுக்கு பிறகு சொன்னவங்க உங்களோட அப்பா செத்த உங்களோட சித்தப்பா செத்ததெல்லாம் நீங்கள் இதுக்காக சப்போர்ட் பண்ண முடியாத உங்களை ஒவ்வொரு ஆளாக கொண்டிருக்கோம். ஒவ்வொரு ஆளும் செத்தது ஏதோ ஒரு விதையில் நீங்கள் சப்போர்ட் பண்ணிக்க. நான் இவங்க எந்த வித சப்போர்ட்டும் இல்லை. ஆனால் ஏதோ சப்போர்ட்டில் செஞ்ச முடியாத நாங்கள் இது செஞ்சோம். அந்த நிலைமையை நீ உண்டுபடுத்திருந்தாங்க. ஆனால் அந்த நிலைமைக்குள்ளே நீ இப்போ உள்ளாயிட்டா நீ போனது இந்த நாட்டுக்கு செஞ்ச தேச துரோகம். அண்டு நீ தேச துரோகி என்ற ரீதியெல்லாம் பார்த்தவங்க நீ எப்போ இருந்தாலும் நீ தேச துரோகி தான்.
Sri Lanka and Australia are relying on their navies to stop the boats. Their success will determine how many reach Australia, but one thing is sure. Unless the situation for Tamils inside Sri Lanka changes, the boats will keep on coming.